publication, which I have to say was a dream to... The editor of the publication has always said that any good writer will just bleed on the paper. Literally burst a vein. And then when we talk to young writers, we say, just empty it all out, and then we can pull back and extract and take out what we don't want. I have to tell you, totally did that.
I did. I use similar language, and my editor hates when I say this, but yes, I vomited onto the page, and it did produce both and.
So how did you get the time to do it? That's my first question.
It did end up being a COVID book. I was meant to write this book many years ago, actually. It was, I haven't talked about this in a while. My deadline was pre-COVID. And I just could never find time. I think there was some part of me that, was, uncertain that I wanted to actually do the book. But it really came to, I was a single mother at the time. And living in New York and balancing work and trying to figure out what to do, and in some ways still recovering from the loss of the 2016 election. And so it wasn't until, like the rest of the world, I was shut in my apartment and really wrote it from March of 2020 through December, even though I had had fits and spurts in the summer and the 2 summers before.
So, and you wrote it, right? You didn't have a ghostwriter.
I started out with a ghostwriter, which I think in hindsight was a mistake because the story is so personal.
Yeah.
And what I rediscovered, so we tried that experiment, it didn't work out. And then I just started writing on the page. What I ended up needing, and I found in an old friend, Ruby Shamir, who basically collaborated with me. And what she did is she was the architect of the book. She's the one who... And not just the architect, she was the person who I would, write pages and pages and pages, and then she would basically challenge me on a few things. Like, I know you really like Moonah. Why are we talking about her? What is the point to this? So sort of the structure, the architecture, the themes in every chapter, and she really was a partner in so many ways and brought up, I think, the best of the story. And it's a very long story.
Yes.
So,
but it's a very interesting story though, because I open it up, and the first story you tell me about, and I have to tell you, I swear on my heart, I cried. I had tears on the train coming in this morning, literally reading a piece about the the 2 times your mother cried, and you talked about one. And I don't know if I've not got to the second one, but the one time she cries, she loses you in the market.
Yeah.
And the very fact that you remember that, tell me about that.
It is, it's funny, I've been on a book tour for so long and no one's asked me that story, but it is the opening story of the book, and it's this concept of being lost and being found, frankly. But yes, I tell the story of moving to Saudi Arabia when I was 2, with my family, and I had an older sister, a 4-year-old sister, and a 7-year-old brother at the time. And we, I was born in Kalamazoo, Michigan. We were living this very sort of Midwestern life. My parents had emigrated, my dad from India, my mom from Pakistan. And so here we are moving to Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, in the late 70s. And we went to the souk, the old city in the market to shop. And this is pre the days of cell phones, pre the days of, frankly, even necessarily the language not being a barrier. A lot of people didn't speak English, my parents didn't speak Arabic yet. And so this fear, this experience of being in the market and getting sort of all, here I am, this little American child, overwhelmed by all the senses and the smells of the shawarma and the incense and seeing all the dates. And, it's a really kind of, so many things for your senses to experience, and all the women had to be covered back then. So all the women were dressed in these black abayas, and I grabbed onto somebody else's abaya, thinking it was my mom, and walked along with her. And it's only when I looked up that I realized it wasn't my mother. And later on, she tells me the story of it being one of the worst experiences of my life. But after a while, my mother, they did find me. And but I do share that it was the first time I'd ever seen my mother cry. And but when you have those moments, and that story came to me because when I sat down, the first question I was asked by my editor was just start with your first memory. Like, what was the most searing memory? Right. And that was it for me.
Right. Which is what I love about how, and you said it, you actually said what I was going to say. You started a journey with being lost, and now you're found.
Yeah.
Because you literally have, I feel from reading about you, tell me a little bit about the start and end. And I'm doing this not in the correct order, unfortunately, but I think we kind of, for me, when I saw that, I was like, and you find yourself, because you discover yourself in situations like this so much more than you've literally, the journey you've had, and you haven't been able to take it on board and digest it in the moment, because it's difficult. You're just on everything is about now.
Well, I think a lot of people like me who have somewhat of a public sort of identity will often kind of start their story with the most well-known thing that's happened to them, and whether that's, in my case, who I worked for, who I was married to, or being in Democratic politics for 25 years, that, those are all things that people often remember. But the reason I grounded the story, and we did start at the beginning and start with the history, is because I think so much, the question that often comes up as it relates to me is this notion of how are you so resilient? How did you go through so many hardships continuously through your life? And for me, I think for many of us, if you understand where that person comes from and their roots, and I tell this story in the book about my father, who, as I mentioned, my parents immigrated. They were Fulbright scholars, but when I was 2, my dad was essentially diagnosed with a terminal illness until he had 5 to 10 years, and he had a choice, which was either, do that, get his affairs in order, as his doctor recommended, or to go out and live the most extraordinary life that he could live while he had time on this earth. And that's what we did. 2 months later, we moved to Saudi Arabia. And they raised us with this real sense of knowing where we came from, understanding who we were. And because my parents came from 2 countries that were at war, you couldn't identify as either Indian or Pakistani. We identified as both. But really, for my parents, it was your identity is as an American.
Right.
Because, to us, that my parents had lived the American dream. It was this notion of choice and freedom and self-determination and core to what it is to be an American living in a democracy. So we were raised as American as Muslims, and my parents were practicing Muslims. My dad would say, a person is only as good as a person is like a plant, and a plant is only as good as its roots. And if you nurture those roots, the plant is going to be okay. So when I left Saudi Arabia, I lived there, my whole childhood. I moved to this country when I was 17 for university, and the message my father gave to me was, before I left, was that moving to America is going to be like a revolution for you, because you lived in this fairly certainly controlled, very coveted, privileged environment. My parents were academics. We were always, very comfortable. And we got to travel the world. They were academics. We got summers off. We went all over the world, made us curious about other people and cultures. But this idea that, he said, you will have total freedom. You can make whatever choice that you want. But I just want to remind you of one thing, that no freedom in this world is absolute. That every choice you're going to make in your life is going to have consequences. So think about that. And that's what grounded me in this sort of deep faith and love, this deep, faith, like love of my faith, because I am Muslim, and I did have that grounding. And knowing where I came from and who I was, and so being able to walk into the White House at 21, kind of excited about how different I was, and proud of what I knew that was different from a lot of people around me, and curious about the world.
So, and you've touched on something that's a really nice opener to take me to how and why and what an amazing footprint to land in the White House. So was that conscious?
It's one of the reasons why, I commend what you do, because I think this notion of representation mattering, for women to see something, to believe it's possible for them. But for me, it was Christiane Amanpour, and seeing her on TV. I lived in the Gulf during that Persian, Operation Desert Storm, the Persian Gulf War, when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, and the United States, led by the United States, but the entire Western world uniting to go in to repel Saddam's forces. And me sitting in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, with our TV on. It was back in the days when, everything was on CNN International, and seeing this woman, appear on my screen. She looked like she came from my part of the world. I write this, like, if she was blonde, blue-eyed, her name was Mary Smith, I'm not sure I would have had the same reaction.
Right.
But to me, she just seemed like this extraordinary truth teller and, just so brave and strong and smart. And so I went to university to become Christian Amanpour. And it was only when I was at university studying journalism, I found that I really liked politics and international relations. I was taking a lot of those courses, and I had a friend who was interning at the White House for Mike McCurry. And she said, look, if you want to be Christian Amanpour, go intern for Mike McCurry. But to the point, the conversation you and I had just now about things happening in our life for a reason. And I often say that so much of my life is a combination of fate, luck, and just being in the right place, in the right, and obviously hard work. But I was accepted into the White House internship program, but I was not put anywhere in any press office. I was put in the First Lady's office, given my background. And mother was a big activist and advocate for women. And given Hillary's experience in Beijing and, the then First Lady, and my mom had been to the conference as well. And so they said, just message-wise, she was aligned. And so they picked me.
Wow.
They saw something and they picked me.
Right. And you do have a very comfortable presence, which is amazing.
Wait, yes, I do. But I did, my father ended up passing away right before I left for university. And I did have that, sort of deep-seated, that, this trauma that stays with you in that, I in fact share how I was so in shock, even though we didn't know he was that ill, like us children, it was a secret from us. And, even though my dad, encouraged us to be active and eat healthy and eat well. And, we could eat ice cream, but we had to have fruit at every meal. We didn't know how ill he was. To me, He was a superhero, even though, he weighed 90 pounds in the months before he passed away. And I wasn't able for years to tell anybody that he was gone. It was that difficult for me to lose him. I was very, very close to my dad. I had a more complicated relationship with my mother. And that trauma did stay with me for a while. And I think I ended up being a little closed off. And I think that's when it started, my wanting to be behind the scenes, never wanting to be the center of attention. So I was always prepared to work hard and do the best I could at my job. I never wanted to be the center of attention. And that is a direct result of having lost my dad. And then slowly over the years, that has all kind of come back with his inspiration. The book really was written in part as a love letter to my dad and to honor my mom and all she's done to give me this extraordinary life.
That's amazing. And thank you for sharing that. I know that's a little bit personal, but it does give us, I think one of the things that you managed to do very successfully, I come back to the book because it's what I learned without actually meeting you, in the interesting way you make me feel like I'm there. I thought that was, and I always say that good authors are ones that any story that's told is like you're sitting next to somebody and you're having that journey with them. And you do that so successfully in just making me feel like I was there, I was in the room. So you touch on, obviously, Queen Elizabeth passed, Her Highness Queen Elizabeth that we talk about, and England, you were in Buckingham Palace. You were part of the whole wedding. How did you feel when when you learned about her passing in having met her?
Well, I, to the point that you just made about, the way I chose to approach this book is when I actually sat down to write, and the young woman who was doing my research with, we researched all the articles about you. This was 2018. She says all the headlines about you in the tabloids particularly, they all either say what is wrong with her or what is she thinking. And so when I chose to write the story, I intentionally chose to not tell. I just wanted to show.
Right.
So it really was very much a show, not tell. I really try to take the reader on a journey with me
Very successful.
and just share the story. But, the reason the Buckingham Palace experience was so memorable is it was shortly after I'd gotten married. And, being able to work in the White House back in the mid-90s at a time when the United States was arguably the sole superpower in the world. When there was, the economy was booming. It felt like peace was happening everywhere. The Berlin Wall had fallen. All these amazing things were happening. You had a First Lady who was championing women's rights. around the world. And so it was, as I say, politics on steroids.
Right.
And I got to see and do and meet all kinds of extraordinary people. And Queen Elizabeth, I had, the great honor of being in Her Majesty's presence several times. But that trip was particularly special because it happened shortly after I'd gotten married. I'd fallen in love. I had this sort of fairy tale, both life and marriage, but the one thing that both me and my husband at the time were constantly very conscious of is how privileged this life was. And so we approached, I have to say, just about every day with a tremendous amount of gratitude. We look at each other and say, can you believe we're here and doing this? And that was that moment. I was newly pregnant. It was a huge secret. Nobody knew, including my boss. And we're spending the night at Buckingham Palace. This was because President Obama was invited for a state visit. So the whole thing was just magical and extraordinary. And actually, there's a particular memory of one of the Queen's ladies in waiting taking Hillary was Secretary of State at the time, for a walk in the Queen's Gardens. And I remember the instructions that the footman gave us is that, if you're walking down the hall and you see Her Majesty, you can, if she acknowledges you, you can acknowledge her back. And if she keeps walking, it's her house. And I was really taken by how warm, even though it was so formal, but how warm and welcoming the whole environment was. And I think that's one of the things that was so special about her. I mean, she was iconic, but it was her being able to keep this sort of sense of majesty, which she was, and a kind of a respect for the office, but just the most wonderful hostess, gracious in all the times that I was able to meet her.